The biting wind, sharp as a fresh-honed blade, tore through the Bitterroot Valley, carrying the first whispers of the Montana winter. It was October of 1873, and the air already promised a season of unforgiving cold. Elara Knutson, her face smudged with earth and determination, didn't seem to notice. She stood barely 5 feet tall, but her frame, hardened by years of frontier life, moved with an unyielding rhythm. With a shovel that felt twice her weight, she was methodically piling dark, rich soil against the log walls of her small cabin, packing it tight, foot by laborious foot. Her 9-year-old daughter, Ingrid, struggled to drag a smaller bucket of dirt, her brow furrowed in concentration, while 6-year-old Lars, bundled in a patched wool coat, tried to mimic his mother with a toy spade, mostly just making mud pies. From a distance, Jedediah Stone, a homesteader whose military bearing still clung to him despite years of farming, watched with a shake of his head. "That woman's gone daft," he muttered to Silas Blackwood, a carpenter from back east who prided himself on proper joinery and square corners. Silas, leaning against his own sturdy, unburned cabin, chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Dirt don't hold heat, Jed. It just makes a mess. She'll have a damp, moldy tomb by Christmas, mark my words." Their words, carried on the wind, didn't reach Elara, or if they did, she paid them no mind. Her focus was absolute, her movements precise, driven by a silent, desperate prayer against the coming freeze. The small settlement of Willow Creek Outpost, a cluster of 12 cabins strung along the river, had never seen such a sight. Elara had arrived in Montana Territory 5 years prior, a young Norwegian immigrant with her husband Leif and their infant daughter. Leif, a man of quiet strength, had built their cabin with his own hands, a testament to his dreams. But the frontier was a harsh mistress, and a year ago a sudden fever had claimed him, leaving Elara a widow with 2 young children and a patch of land. The community had offered condolences, some meager help, but mostly they'd left her to her grief and the daunting task of survival. She wasn't one for idle chatter or public displays of emotion. Her grief was a private burden, her resolve a silent fire. She'd learned to listen more than she spoke, to observe the land, and to respect the wisdom of those who had lived on it for generations. Her unusual project had begun 3 weeks ago, after a particularly chilling night. She'd spent days hauling rocks for the foundation, then weeks felling and notching logs, but the cabin, though sound, felt vulnerable. It was a conversation with an old Flathead woman, a chance encounter during a trade for dried berries that had sparked the idea. The woman, her face a roadmap of ancient wisdom, had spoken of earth lodges, of how the ground itself could be a blanket against the cold. Elara remembered her own grandmother's stories of Norwegian turf houses, sod roofs, and earth-insulated walls that kept families warm through brutal Scandinavian winters. It wasn't just dirt, it was thermal mass, a principle as old as the mountains themselves. Klaus Richter, a German immigrant farmer known for his meticulous crop rotations and skepticism of anything not proven by generations of European agricultural practice, rode by on his wagon, pausing to stare. "Frau Knutson, what in God's name are you doing? You will ruin the logs. They will rot," he called out, his voice thick with concern. Hamish McGregor, a burly Scottish ranch hand who'd seen his share of harsh winters, reined in his pony beside Klaus. "Aye, lass, you'll be inviting every critter in the valley right into your parlor, and the damp, you'll be coughing till spring." Their warnings, though well-intentioned, were rooted in conventional wisdom, in the way things had always been done on the American frontier. No one had ever seen a cabin buried in dirt like this. Elara simply nodded, a small, tight smile on her lips, and continued her work. She knew the risks. She knew the ridicule. But she also knew the alternative. A winter spent huddled by a constantly burning fire, consuming precious firewood, and still feeling the icy tendrils of cold creep through the chinked logs. Her children, Ingrid and Lars, deserved better than that. They deserved warmth, and she would move mountains of earth if that's what it took. The sun dipped below the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and Elara, her back aching, finally straightened up. She'd managed to pile the earth nearly 2 feet high on the north and west walls, the sides most exposed to the prevailing winds. The cabin now looked less like a traditional log home and more like a small earthen mound, a strange organic growth on the prairie. If you value forgotten frontier wisdom that kept families alive against impossible odds, hit that like button. It helps us unearth more stories like Alara's. The next morning, the air was even crisper, a clear sign that winter was truly on its way. Alara rose before dawn, her muscles stiff but her resolve unbroken. She had a plan, a vision of warmth that fueled her every swing of the shovel. She wasn't just piling dirt, she was building a thermal battery, a shield against the coming cold. The earth, she knew, had a remarkable capacity to absorb and store heat, releasing it slowly over time. This wasn't some wild, untested notion. It was a principle understood by ancient cultures across the globe. The Vikings, her own ancestors, had built turf houses, their thick sod roofs and walls providing insulation that kept them warm through centuries of harsh Nordic winters. And here in Montana, the indigenous people had perfected the earth lodge, a structure that maintained a stable interior temperature, regardless of the outside extremes. She worked tirelessly, day after day, her children helping where they could. Ingrid, with her small hands, carefully packed handfuls of soil into crevices, while Lars, ever the mimic, dug small trenches around the base, diverting rainwater away from the new earthen berm. Alara focused on creating a continuous layer, at least 18 inches thick, around the cabin's perimeter, extending up to the eaves. She even planned to pile a foot of earth onto the roof, supported by a reinforced frame, to add another layer of insulation. This wasn't just about keeping the cold out, it was about keeping the warmth in. The logs themselves, while good insulators, couldn't compare to the sheer thermal mass of packed earth. Silas Blackwood, the carpenter, stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to borrow a saw, but mostly to observe. He ran a hand over the packed earth, a frown creasing his brow. "It's unconventional, Alara," he admitted, his usual certainty wavering slightly. "But the damp, you'll have rot in a year, I tell you." Alara, wiping sweat from her forehead, explained patiently. "I've dug a drainage ditch, Silas, a good 2 feet deep all around the base. And the earth is packed tight, it'll shed water, not absorb it. The logs are treated with pine tar, too." Silas still looked unconvinced, but the sheer effort and meticulousness of her work gave him pause. He hadn't seen such dedication since he'd built his own first cabin. Meanwhile, Jed Stone, the former military man, was more concerned about the structural integrity. "That much weight, Alara? On those logs? You'll have the roof cave in on you and the children," he warned, his voice gruff but laced with genuine worry. Alara pointed to the extra support beams she'd installed inside, thick timbers she'd hauled from the forest herself. "Leif built this cabin strong, Jed, and I've added more support. It'll hold." She knew the weight was considerable, perhaps 20,000 pounds of earth on the walls and roof, but she'd reinforced every critical point. The cabin, once a simple log structure, was slowly transforming into a fortress of earth and timber. Subscribed to help preserve traditional knowledge that kept families alive when modern builders had no answers. The days grew shorter, the air grew colder, and the first dusting of snow appeared on the distant peaks. Alara had finished the berming, a solid 18 to 24 inches of earth now hugging her cabin walls. The roof, too, was covered with a foot of soil, carefully sloped to shed water. The cabin looked like it had grown out of the very ground, a natural part of the landscape. She'd also spent weeks gathering firewood, stacking it neatly under a small lean-to. She knew she'd need less than her neighbors, but she wouldn't take chances. The children, too, felt the change. Ingrid often pressed her hand against the inside of the earthen wall, marveling at its cool, stable temperature. Lars, no longer playing with his toy spade, helped his mother bring in the last of the dried herbs and vegetables from their small garden. One evening, as the temperature outside plummeted to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, Alara placed a thermometer inside her cabin. It read a comfortable 65 degrees. She smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached her eyes. The thermal mass was working. The earth, warmed by the day's meager sun and the cabin's small hearth, was slowly radiating that heat back into the living space. Her neighbors, meanwhile, were already burning through their firewood at an alarming rate, their chimneys puffing smoke day and night. Klaus Richter, passing by Alara's cabin, noticed the distinct lack of smoke from her chimney. He scratched his head, a flicker of curiosity replacing his usual skepticism. The real test, however, was yet to come. The old-timer spoke of the Great Freeze, a blizzard that could drop temperatures to unimaginable lows, a storm that could claim lives. And as November bled into December, the sky began to take on a bruised, ominous hue. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a relentless, blinding torrent. Within hours, the Bitterroot Valley was swallowed by a whiteout. The temperature, which had been hovering around zero, began to plummet. This wasn't just a cold snap. This was the kind of storm that killed. The kind that froze rivers solid, that trapped families in their homes, that made even the most seasoned frontiersmen pray for dawn. The wind shrieked, rattling the windows of every cabin in Willow Creek outpost. Inside Alara's earthen home, a different story unfolded. The blizzard raged outside, a furious, white-knuckled assault on the small cabin. The thermometer outside her door, nailed to a sheltered post, registered an unthinkable -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was so cold it felt like shards of glass in your lungs. But inside, the cabin was a haven. Alara had a small fire burning in the hearth, just enough to take the edge off, to boil water for tea, and to keep a pot of stew simmering. The children, bundled in blankets, played a quiet game of checkers by the flickering firelight. Ingrid, ever observant, pointed to the thermometer hanging on the wall. "Mama, it's 68 degrees, she whispered, her eyes wide. Alara nodded, a profound sense of relief washing over her. 68 degrees inside, while outside, the world was a frozen hell at -40. That was a staggering 108-degree difference, and a 50-degree advantage over what a conventional cabin would typically hold in such conditions. The earth, her silent guardian, was doing its work. The thick berms of soil, the foot of earth on the roof, had created an impenetrable barrier. The thermal mass, slowly releasing the heat it had absorbed over the past weeks, kept the interior stable, comfortable, and most importantly, safe. She only needed to add a small log to the fire every few hours, a fraction of what her neighbors were burning. She knew Jed Stone, Silas Blackwood, Klaus Richter, and Hamish McGregor would be feeding their fires constantly, desperately trying to fend off the encroaching cold. Their cabins, built with conventional methods, would be struggling to maintain even 20 degrees above freezing. A knock, faint but insistent, came from the door. Alara hesitated, then opened it a crack. It was Jed Stone, his face a mask of concern, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Alara, is everything all right? We haven't seen smoke from your chimney in hours. We were worried you'd frozen solid." He peered past her, his eyes widening at the sight of the warm, cozy interior. The children looked up, startled. "Come in, Jed," Alara said, her voice calm. "It's warm in here." Jed stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat, and immediately felt the difference. The air was still, comfortable, a stark contrast to the gale outside. He looked at the thermometer, then back at Alara, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. If you've ever faced a challenge that seemed impossible, hit that like button and share your story in the comments. Your resilience inspires us all. The blizzard raged for 3 days and 3 nights, an eternity of white fury. When it finally broke, the Bitterroot Valley was transformed into a landscape of pristine, deadly beauty. The snow lay 6 feet deep in drifts, and the air, though no longer howling, was still bitterly cold, hovering around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. As the first rays of weak sunlight pierced the clouds, the residents of Willow Creek Outpost began to emerge, blinking, shivering, and exhausted. Their faces were etched with the strain of constant vigilance, of feeding fires, of battling the cold. Jed Stone, Silas Blackwood, Klaus Richter, and Hamish McGregor were among the first to venture out. They gathered at Alara's cabin, drawn by a mixture of concern and profound curiosity. They'd seen her chimney, barely smoking, throughout the storm. They'd heard the stories of her cabin being buried in dirt. Now, they needed to see for themselves. Alara opened her door, her children peeking out from behind her skirts. She looked tired, but not defeated. Her cabin, though covered in snow, stood firm, a testament to her unconventional wisdom. "Elara," Jed began, his voice hoarse, "how in tarnation did you manage? My cabin, I swear, it barely held 30 degrees and I burned through a cord of wood in 3 days. Silas nodded grimly. Mine was little better. The cold just seeped through the logs like water through a sieve. Klaus and Hamish chimed in with similar tales of struggle. Elara invited them inside. The air was still a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The contrast with the 18-degree outside air was palpable, a 50-degree advantage that spoke volumes. She pointed to her small woodpile. "I used less than half a cord," she stated simply. "Perhaps 60% less than what you all burned." The men stared, dumbfounded. 60% less firewood. That wasn't just a convenience. That was a matter of survival on the frontier. That meant fewer dangerous trips into the frozen woods, less back-breaking labor, more resources for other necessities. Silas Blackwood, the carpenter, ran his hand over the interior wall, feeling the stable temperature. "The thermal mass," he murmured, a dawning understanding in his eyes. "The earth, it held the heat." Klaus Richter, the meticulous farmer, pulled out a small notebook. 68 degrees inside, 18 outside, 50 degrees difference, and 60% less wood. "This is remarkable, Frau Knudsen." Even Hamish McGregor, the gruff ranch hand, looked impressed. "Aye, lass, you've done it. You've built a proper warm home where others would have frozen." The laughter and skepticism had vanished, replaced by a profound respect. Elara hadn't just survived, she had thrived, proving that sometimes the oldest ways were the best ways. The story of Elara Knudsen and her earth-burned cabin spread quickly through Willow Creek Outpost and beyond. It wasn't long before other homesteaders facing the same brutal winters and dwindling firewood supplies began to emulate her technique. Jed Stone, the former military man, was among the first. He spent the next summer carefully burning his own cabin, following Elara's advice to the letter. Silas Blackwood, the carpenter, began to incorporate earth burning into his designs, adapting his skills to this new, old wisdom. Klaus Richter, ever the pragmatist, started experimenting with earth-sheltered root cellars, marveling at their stable temperatures. Elara's cabin became a beacon of resilience, a quiet testament to the power of observation and the wisdom of forgotten traditions. Her children, Ingrid and Lars, grew up in a home that was always warm, always safe, even when the blizzards raged outside. They learned from their mother not just how to survive, but how to innovate, how to look beyond conventional thinking for solutions. The technique she employed, earth burning, was far from new. It was a practice that had kept people warm for millennia. From the ancient pit houses of the American Southwest to the sod houses of the Great Plains and the turf houses of Scandinavia that stood for over 100 years, humanity had long understood the insulating power of the earth. Today, we see a resurgence of these principles in modern earth-sheltered homes designed for incredible energy efficiency. These contemporary structures, often built into hillsides or covered with soil, boast drastically reduced heating and cooling costs, sometimes cutting energy consumption by 70 to 80% compared to conventional buildings. They maintain stable interior temperatures year-round, just as Elara's cabin did in the heart of a Montana winter. The lessons learned by a single mother in 1873, dismissed as foolishness by her neighbors, are now validated by architects and engineers seeking sustainable, resilient housing solutions. Join others who are documenting and preserving traditional techniques that modern builders have forgotten. Subscribe to our channel. Elara Knudsen's story isn't just about a warm cabin. It's a profound reminder that wisdom often lies hidden in plain sight, dismissed by those too quick to judge. It's a testament to the quiet strength of a woman who dared to trust her instincts, who listened to the land and its ancient inhabitants, and who, through sheer will and ingenuity, secured her family's survival. Her legacy isn't just a warmer home. It's a philosophical insight into how often we overlook simple, effective solutions because they don't fit our preconceived notions. Sometimes the most profound innovations are simply rediscoveries, and survival itself depends not on rigid adherence to the familiar, but on an open mind and the courage to cover your cabin in dirt.